The wagon wheel splintered with a crack that echoed through the empty Colorado plains, sending Elizabeth Thornton's heart plummeting to her stomach. The sound represented not just the breaking of wood and metal, but the shattering of her last hope. She had fled Boston with barely enough money to start a new life, and now she was stranded 15 miles outside of Black Hawk with a broken wheel, dwindling supplies, and the sun beginning its westward descent. Elizabeth brushed a strand of auburn hair from her sweat-dampened face and surveyed the damage. The front right wheel had completely collapsed, the spokes jutting out at awkward angles. She was no carpenter, and even if she were, she lacked the tools to make such a repair. Her faithful mare, Penny, nickered softly as if sensing her distress. "It will be fine," Elizabeth murmured, more to herself than to the horse. She squinted at the horizon, searching for any sign of civilization, but saw only endless prairie grass bending in the hot August wind of 1876. She had left everything behind: a comfortable life, a respected family name, and a fiancé whose betrayal still felt like a knife between her ribs. James Whittaker had been everything she thought she wanted: educated, wealthy, and from one of Boston's finest families. Finding him in the arms of her cousin 3 weeks before their wedding had destroyed not only her trust, but her belief in love itself. Elizabeth tied Penny to a scrubby tree and retrieved her canteen from the wagon. Taking a careful sip of the lukewarm water, she considered her options. She could wait for someone to pass by, but the road to Black Hawk wasn't heavily traveled. She could attempt to walk to town, but that would mean abandoning most of her possessions, everything she had left in the world. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance made her spin around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small revolver tucked in her travel bag. The West was dangerous for a woman alone, as she'd been reminded countless times during her journey. As the rider approached, Elizabeth stood tall, determined not to show fear despite her vulnerable position. The man who came into view sat atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, dusty denim trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. When he drew closer and tipped his hat back, Elizabeth could see he was perhaps 30 years of age, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Afternoon, madam," he called, pulling his horse to a stop several yards away, a respectful distance. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble." Elizabeth lifted her chin. "The wheel broke. I was on my way to Black Hawk." The man dismounted with fluid grace and approached slowly, his eyes assessing the damage to her wagon before returning to her face. "Name's Lucas Hawkins. I own a ranch about 3 miles north of here." He gestured to the wagon. "Mind if I take a look?" Elizabeth hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Please. I'm Elizabeth Thornton." Lucas knelt beside the broken wheel, strong hands examining the damage with practiced ease. "Been traveling long, Miss Thornton?" 3 weeks, she replied, watching him carefully. "From Boston." He whistled low. "That's quite a journey to make alone." "I manage well enough on my own," she said stiffly, the memory of James's betrayal flashing through her mind. Lucas stood, dusting his hands on his trousers. "Wheels badly damaged, but not beyond repair. Got the tools at my ranch to fix it, but it'll take a couple of days. Sun's getting low. Not safe for you to camp out here alone." Elizabeth bristled at the implication that she couldn't fend for herself, though she knew he was right. "What do you propose, Mr. Hawkins?" "Lucas," he corrected with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I propose we unload what you need for a night or two, secure your wagon, and you come stay at my ranch until I can fix your wheel. Got a housekeeper there, Mrs. Porter, so your reputation will remain intact." Elizabeth weighed her options quickly. Lucas Hawkins seemed honorable enough, and the mention of a housekeeper was reassuring. Still, she had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. "I appreciate the offer," she said cautiously, "but I wouldn't want to impose." Lucas shook his head. "No imposition. Can't leave a lady stranded out here with night coming on. There are wolves, not to mention less savory characters who might pass by." The matter-of-fact way he stated these dangers sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. She glanced at her wagon, her home for the past 3 weeks, and then back at Lucas Hawkins's steady gaze. "Very well," she conceded. "Thank you for your kindness." Within an hour, they had transferred her essential belongings to his horse and secured the wagon as best they could. Lucas helped her mount his stallion before climbing up behind her, maintaining a respectful distance despite the intimate arrangement. As they rode toward his ranch, Elizabeth became acutely aware of his presence, the strength in his arms as he held the reins on either side of her, the clean scent of soap beneath the dust of the trail. She silently chastised herself for noticing such things. She had sworn off men after James's betrayal, determined never again to be so foolish as to give her heart away. The Hawkins ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a sturdy two-story house with a wide porch, several outbuildings, and a corral where a few horses grazed peacefully. It was modest compared to the estates Elizabeth had known in Boston, but there was something inviting about its solid presence against the backdrop of the mountains. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on an apron. "Lucas Hawkins, I was beginning to worry. Supper's been ready this past half hour," and she stopped short when she noticed Elizabeth. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." Lucas dismounted and helped Elizabeth down with gentle hands. "Mrs. Porter, this is Miss Elizabeth Thornton. Her wagon broke down on the Black Hawk Road. She'll be staying with us until I can repair it." Mrs. Porter's face immediately softened with concern. "You poor dear. Must have been frightening out there alone." She shot Lucas an approving glance. "Good thing Mr. Hawkins found you. Come inside now, you must be famished." Elizabeth followed Mrs. Porter into the house, struck by the cozy warmth of the interior. A fire crackled in the stone hearth despite the summer heat, casting a golden glow over the simple but well-made furniture. It was nothing like the ornate parlors of Boston, yet there was an inviting quality to its unpretentious comfort. "I'll show you to the spare room where you can freshen up," Mrs. Porter said, leading her up a narrow staircase. "Dinner will be on the table shortly. Nothing fancy, mind you, but Mr. Hawkins always says my cooking beats anything in Denver's finest hotels." The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small window overlooking the ranch yard. Elizabeth set down her bag and moved to the window, watching as Lucas led his horse to the barn. There was an ease to his movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. She turned away, reminding herself that she was here by necessity, not choice. In 2 days, her wagon would be repaired, and she would continue to Black Hawk as planned. There, she would use her teaching credentials to secure a position and build a new life, one that didn't depend on anyone but herself. After washing the dust from her face and hands and changing into her one clean dress, a simple blue cotton that had seen better days, Elizabeth made her way downstairs. The aroma of roast beef and fresh bread made her stomach growl, reminding her that she had eaten nothing since a meager breakfast at dawn. Lucas was already seated at the table, his hair damp from washing up. He rose when she entered, pulling out a chair for her with old-world courtesy that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice carrying a hint of approval at her transformed appearance. "Thank you again for your assistance, Mr. Hawkins," Elizabeth said formally as she took her seat. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Lucas," he reminded her with a slight smile. "And out here, neighbors help neighbors. It's how we survive." "But we're not neighbors," Elizabeth pointed out. "I'm a stranger." His blue eyes met hers across the table. "No one stays a stranger long in these parts, Miss Thornton." Mrs. Porter bustled in with a platter of roast beef and dishes of vegetables, ending their exchange. Throughout the meal, Elizabeth found herself studying Lucas surreptitiously. There was a sadness behind his eyes that didn't match his easy manner, a shadow that suggested he knew something of loss himself. "What brings you to Black Hawk, if you don't mind my asking?" Lucas said as Mrs. Porter served apple pie for dessert. Elizabeth hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "I'm a teacher," she finally said. "I heard there was need for one in Black Hawk." "There is indeed," Lucas confirmed. "The town's growing with the mining operations. Lots of families settling in, wanting education for their children." "And you, Mr. Hawkins? Have you always been a rancher?" Elizabeth asked, deflecting attention from herself. A shadow crossed his face. "No, I came west after the war, served with the Union Army, then tried my hand at mining before realizing I preferred the company of horses to men." He offered a self-deprecating smile. "Bought this place 8 years ago when it was little more than a shack and some overgrazed land." He's being modest, Mrs. Porter interjected as she refilled their coffee cups. This is one of the finest small spreads in the territory now. Mr. Hawkins has a way with horses, trains them better than anyone. Lucas looked uncomfortable with the praise. I just treat them fairly, that's all. Elizabeth sensed there was more to his story but didn't press. Everyone had parts of themselves they preferred to keep hidden, she certainly did. After dinner, Lucas excused himself to tend to evening chores, leaving Elizabeth to help Mrs. Porter with the dishes despite the older woman's protests. He's a good man, Mrs. Porter said as they worked side by side. Too much alone, though. Lost his wife and baby daughter to fever 6 years back. Elizabeth's hands stilled on the plate she was drying. I'm sorry to hear that. Mrs. Porter nodded sadly. Broke him in ways I'm not sure ever fully mended. Throws himself into his work. Rarely goes to town except for supplies. First time I've seen him bring anyone here in nearly 2 years. The information shifted something in Elizabeth's perception of Lucas Hawkins. She recognized the armor of solitude he wore. It was not so different from her own. Later that evening, Elizabeth sat on the front porch, enjoying the cool night air after the heat of the day. The sky above was a vast tapestry of stars unlike anything she'd seen in Boston, where gas lamps and buildings obscured much of the heavens. Beautiful, isn't it? Lucas's voice came from the darkness before he stepped into view, a cup of coffee in his hand. Breathtaking, Elizabeth agreed. I've never seen so many stars. He settled into a chair nearby. One of the reasons I stay. No matter what happens down here, they're always there, unchanging. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional soft nickering from the horses in the corral. Mrs. Porter mentioned your loss, Elizabeth said quietly. I'm very sorry. Lucas stiffened slightly before his shoulders relaxed on an exhale. Thank you. It was a long time ago. Does the pain lessen? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful in the dim light spilling from the house windows. It changes. Becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. He paused. You've known loss too, I think. Elizabeth looked away. Of a different kind. Oh. He didn't press, and she was grateful for his understanding. Well, Miss Thornton, whatever brought you all the way from Boston to Black Hawk, I hope you find what you're looking for. With that, he rose and bid her good night, leaving Elizabeth alone with the stars and her thoughts. She wondered if she would recognize what she was looking for when she found it, having embarked on this journey with only the vague notion of escape and reinvention. Morning dawned clear and bright, the sun painting the distant mountains with gold and rose. Elizabeth woke to the smells of coffee and bacon and the sound of activity from the yard below her window. Dressing quickly, she made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Porter alone in the kitchen. Good morning, dear. The housekeeper greeted her cheerfully. Sleep well? Very well, thank you, Elizabeth replied, accepting a cup of coffee. Is Mr. Hawkins already at work? Mrs. Porter nodded. Been up since before dawn, that one. Said he'd ride out to your wagon after breakfast to assess what he needs for the repairs. After breakfast, Elizabeth walked out to the barn, drawn by the sound of Lucas's voice. She found him talking softly to her mare, Penny, whom he must have retrieved from the broken wagon earlier that morning. She seems to like you, Elizabeth observed, leaning against the stall door. Lucas turned, a smile warming his features. She's a fine animal. Gentle disposition, but strong. You chose well. My father selected her, Elizabeth admitted. He insisted I have a reliable horse for the journey west. Your family supported your decision to come out here? Lucas asked, running a brush along Penny's flank. Elizabeth hesitated. They understood my need for a fresh start. Lucas nodded, seeming to read between the lines. Well, I've taken a look at your wagon. The wheel needs more work than I initially thought. The axle's damaged too. Elizabeth's heart sank. How long will the repairs take? 4 or 5 days, I'm afraid. He studied her face. That creates a problem? No, She twisted her hands together. I don't want to impose on your hospitality for so long. Lucas set down the brush and stepped out of the stall. It's no imposition. Actually, I could use some help while you're here, if you're willing. Help? Elizabeth echoed, surprised. I've been trying to catalog my father's library books he collected over the years. As a teacher, you might have a better system than my haphazard approach. He looked almost boyishly hopeful. Consider it payment for room and board. The request seemed innocent enough, and Elizabeth was glad for the opportunity to feel useful rather than merely a burden. I'd be happy to help. True to his word, after the midday meal, Lucas showed her to a small room off the main parlor where shelves lined the walls, filled with books in various states of organization. A desk sat beneath the window, covered with papers and more stacks of books. My father was a professor before he caught gold fever and came west, Lucas explained. Never found his fortune, but he never stopped collecting books. After he passed, I inherited the lot. Elizabeth ran her fingers along the spines of several volumes, histories, novels, scientific treatises. This is quite a collection. Too valuable to let gather dust, Lucas said. I thought perhaps when the school in Black Hawk is properly established, some might be donated there. Elizabeth looked at him with new appreciation. That's very generous. He shrugged, appearing almost embarrassed. Books should be read, not hoarded. He gestured to the desk. I'll leave you to it then. I need to ride into town for supplies to fix your wagon. After he departed, Elizabeth lost herself in the task of organizing the books, categorizing them by subject and author. It was peaceful work, the kind that allowed her mind to settle after weeks of uncertainty and travel. Occasionally, she would open a volume and find handwritten notes in the margins, Lucas's father's observations, perhaps, or Lucas's own. She was still at work when Lucas returned late in the afternoon. He paused in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. You've made progress, he noted, surveying the now orderly shelves. Elizabeth smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Your father had eclectic tastes. That he did. Lucas stepped into the room, setting a small parcel on the desk. I brought you something from town. Elizabeth untied the brown paper to reveal a small book of poetry. Emily Dickinson, she read, touching the cover with reverent fingers. How did you know? Lucas's smile reached his eyes this time. You mentioned her last night, said you'd had to leave your books behind when you came west. He gestured to the volume. It's not much, but I thought you might like having at least one book that's your own. The simple kindness caught Elizabeth off guard. It had been so long since anyone had given thought to what might please her. Thank you, she said softly. This means more than you know. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Lucas cleared his throat and took a step back. Well, I should see to those wagon parts. Dinner's at 6, Mrs. Porter says. The days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings, Elizabeth would help Mrs. Porter with household tasks. Afternoons, she cataloged books while Lucas worked on her wagon or tended to ranch business. Evenings, they would share dinner and then often sit on the porch, talking of everything and nothing, books they had read, places they had seen, the changing colors of the Colorado sky. Lucas never asked directly about what had driven her from Boston, and Elizabeth never pressed for details about his wife and child. Yet somehow, in the spaces between their conversations, understanding grew. They were both, in their different ways, survivors learning to live with wounds that had changed them. On the fourth day, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, bringing with it sheets of rain that turned the ranch yard to mud and made work on the wagon impossible. Elizabeth stood at the window of the library, watching lightning fork across the darkened sky. Quite a show, Lucas commented, entering with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Elizabeth, their fingers brushing in the exchange. I've always loved storms, she admitted. The raw power of them, it's humbling. And a bit terrifying, Lucas added, standing beside her at the window. The best things often are, Elizabeth said softly. Lucas turned to look at her, his expression serious. What were you running from in Boston, Elizabeth? The use of her first name the first time he had done so made her heart skip. The question hung between them, and for a moment, she considered deflecting as she had done before. But something about this man, with his quiet strength and hidden depths, made her want to speak the truth. A broken engagement, she finally said. My fiancé, I found him with my cousin 3 weeks before our wedding. Lucas's jaw tightened. I'm sorry. It wasn't just the betrayal, Elizabeth continued, the words coming easier now. It was realizing that the life I had planned, the life everyone expected of me, was built on appearances. James never loved me, not really. He loved the idea of me, The perfect society wife I represented. She took a sip of her coffee. When it all fell apart, I knew I couldn't stay. Every sympathetic look, every whispered conversation that stopped when I entered a room, it was suffocating. So you came west to breathe, Lucas said, understanding in his voice. Yes. She met his gaze. To find out who I am when no one is watching, when no one has expectations. Thunder rumbled, closer now, and rain lashed against the windows. And have you found out who you are? Lucas asked. Elizabeth smiled slightly. I'm beginning to. Later that evening, after Mrs. Porter had retired to her room, Elizabeth and Lucas sat before the fire in the parlor. The storm continued unabated, wind howling around the eaves of the house. Tell me about your wife, Elizabeth said quietly. Lucas's hand stilled on the arm of his chair. For a moment, she thought he might not answer, but then he spoke, his voice low. Her name was Sarah. We met in Denver. She was working in her father's mercantile. I was still trying to make a go of mining then. A slight smile touched his lips at the memory. She was fearless, laughed easily, saw something in me worth believing in when I wasn't sure myself. Elizabeth listened, hearing the love that still colored his words. We had 2 good years here at the ranch before Hannah was born. Then the fever came through. Took them both in less than a week. He stared into the fire. I was in Denver selling horses. By the time I got back, it was too late. Oh, Lucas, Elizabeth whispered, her heart aching for him. For a long time, I blamed myself for not being there, he continued. Then I blamed God. Then I just existed, kept the ranch going because it was all I had left of the life we'd built. Elizabeth reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused. What changed? She asked gently. He looked at their joined hands. Time. Mrs. Porter's stubborn insistence that I keep living. And eventually, I realized Sarah would have hated seeing me half alive. His eyes, when they met hers, held a quiet resolve. So I choose, each day, to live fully. Some days are harder than others. The honesty of his admission touched something deep within Elizabeth. She had been existing too, since James's betrayal, running away rather than towards something, nursing her wounds rather than healing them. They sat in companionable silence, hands still linked, as the storm gradually subsided to a gentle rain. When they finally bid each other good night, something had shifted between them, a trust established, a connection deepened. The next morning dawned clear, the world washed clean by the night's storm. Elizabeth woke with a sense of anticipation, though for what, she wasn't entirely sure. After breakfast, she went to check on Penny, only to find Lucas already in the barn, working on her wagon wheel. Good morning, she called, smiling as he looked up. Morning, he returned, setting down his tools. Thought I'd get an early start. Should have your wagon ready by tomorrow, weather permitting. Tomorrow. The word hit Elizabeth with unexpected force. Tomorrow she would leave this place that had begun to feel like a sanctuary. This man whose quiet strength had become a comfort. That's good news, she managed, though her tone belied her words. Lucas studied her face. Is it? Elizabeth busied herself with adjusting Penny's blanket. Of course. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. You haven't imposed, Lucas said quietly. In fact, he hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. In fact, these past days have been the most alive I've felt in years. Elizabeth turned to face him, her heart suddenly racing. Lucas, I know you have plans, he continued quickly. A position waiting in Black Hawk. A new life you've traveled thousands of miles to build. I wouldn't presume to interfere with that. But, Elizabeth prompted, hardly daring to breathe. But I'd like to see you again, after you're settled. If you'd allow it. The simple request, spoken without pretense or pressure, touched Elizabeth deeply. It was so different from the calculated courtship rituals of Boston society, from James's practiced charm. I'd like that very much, she said softly. Relief washed over Lucas's face, followed by a smile that transformed his features. Good. That's good. They stood looking at each other, the air between them charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. Finally, Lucas cleared his throat. I should get back to work on that wheel. But perhaps this evening, if the weather holds, I could show you something? What is it? Elizabeth asked, curiosity piqued. A surprise, he answered with a boyish grin that made him look younger, unburdened. Just wear sturdy shoes. Throughout the day, Elizabeth found herself anticipating the evening with nervous excitement. She had sworn off romantic entanglements after James, determined to be self-sufficient and alone rather than vulnerable again. Yet Lucas Hawkins had somehow slipped past her defenses, not with grand gestures or flowery words, but with simple kindness and honest conversation. As the sun began its descent, Lucas appeared at the house, having changed into a clean shirt. Ready for that surprise? Elizabeth nodded, following him outside to where 2 horses waited, saddled and ready. Can you ride astride? Lucas asked. It's not far, but the terrain's too rough for a side saddle. Elizabeth laughed. I've been riding astride since we left Missouri, Mr. Hawkins. Propriety takes a back seat to practicality on the trail. Lucas's eyes crinkled with amusement. So it does, Miss Thornton. So it does. They rode west from the ranch, following a narrow trail that wound up into the foothills. The air grew cooler as they climbed, scented with pine and wildflowers. Just as the sun hovered above the distant mountains, Lucas led them into a small clearing atop a rise. Here we are, he said, dismounting and helping Elizabeth down from her horse. Elizabeth gasped at the view that spread before them. The entire valley lay below, bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. The ranch looked tiny from this height, a peaceful haven nestled against the vast backdrop of the plains stretching eastward. It's magnificent, she breathed. This is where I come when I need perspective, Lucas said, standing beside her. When the day's troubles seem too large, this place reminds me how small they really are in the grand scheme of things. Elizabeth understood exactly what he meant. From here, her past, the humiliation, the heartbreak, the desperate flight west seemed less overwhelming, merely one chapter in a much larger story. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said. Lucas turned to face her, the setting sun gilding his features. Elizabeth, he began, his voice husky with emotion. I know we've only known each other a handful of days, but sometimes a handful of days can reveal more truth than years of acquaintance. Elizabeth interrupted softly. Yes, he agreed, relief evident in his voice. That's precisely it. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, Lucas raised his hand to her cheek. His touch was gentle, questioning. Elizabeth leaned into it, her eyes closing briefly at the warmth of his palm against her skin. I never expected to find you, Lucas whispered. A broken wagon wasn't in my plans for that day. Nor in mine, Elizabeth replied with a small smile. But I'm grateful for it nonetheless. The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question asked and answered in the meeting of lips. Then it deepened, becoming a conversation of its own, speaking truths neither was ready to voice aloud. When they finally parted, Elizabeth felt breathless, as though she'd been running instead of standing perfectly still in Lucas Hawkins's embrace. I should probably apologize for taking liberties, Lucas said, not sounding particularly sorry. Elizabeth laughed, a sound of pure joy that surprised even her. I think we're well past the point of such formalities, Lucas. They stayed to watch the sunset, sitting close together on a fallen log, talking of small things and large, his plans for the ranch, her hopes for teaching in Black Hawk. As twilight deepened into dusk, they reluctantly mounted their horses for the ride back, both aware that something profound had changed between them. That night, Elizabeth lay awake long after retiring to her room, replaying the day's events in her mind. She had come west to escape pain, to rebuild her life on her own terms. She hadn't planned on meeting someone like Lucas, hadn't wanted to risk her heart again so soon, or perhaps ever. Yet here she was, contemplating possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Morning came too quickly. Elizabeth dressed with care in her best traveling outfit, a practical dark blue skirt and white shirtwaist, and packed her few belongings. When she descended the stairs, Lucas was waiting in the parlor, his expression carefully neutral. The wagon's ready, he said, taking her bag. I've loaded your supplies and checked everything twice. You shouldn't have any more trouble on the road to Black Hawk. Thank you, Elizabeth replied, trying to match his businesslike tone. Mrs. Porter bustled in with a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Food for your journey, dear, the housekeeper said, pressing it into Elizabeth's hands. Can't have you arriving in town on an empty stomach. Elizabeth hugged the older woman impulsively. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Porter. You come back and visit us, you hear? Mrs. Porter said, patting her cheek affectionately. I will, Elizabeth promised, meaning it. Outside, Lucas helped her into the wagon, his hands lingering slightly longer than necessary. The school board meets on Thursdays at the town hall, he said. The chairman is Harold Miller. Mention my name, and he'll see you're treated fairly. Elizabeth nodded, touched by his thoughtfulness. I don't know how to thank you, Lucas. No need, he replied. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a map to the ranch, in case you ever need anything. Or want company. Their eyes met, and all the words they hadn't spoken hung in the air between them. I'll see you soon, Elizabeth said firmly, a promise rather than a polite farewell. Lucas nodded, stepping back as she picked up the reins. Safe travels, Elizabeth Thornton. The journey to Black Hawk took most of the day, giving Elizabeth ample time to think. The town, when she finally arrived, was larger than she had expected, a bustling community of clapboard buildings, mining operations, and surprisingly well-maintained streets. She found the hotel easily enough and secured a room for the night, exhausted but determined to seek out the school board first thing in the morning. Sleep eluded her despite her fatigue. The hotel room, though clean and comfortable, felt sterile after the warmth of Lucas's home. She found herself missing the sound of his voice, the quiet confidence of his presence, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. This is madness, she muttered to herself, staring at the ceiling. You barely know the man. Yet that wasn't entirely true. In their days together, they had shared more honest conversation than she and James had in their entire courtship. Lucas had seen her at her most vulnerable and treated her with respect rather than advantage. He had revealed his own wounds without seeking pity, shown strength without domination. By morning, Elizabeth had made a decision. She would secure her teaching position as planned, establish herself in Black Hawk, and give herself time to be certain of her feelings. If, after a reasonable period, she still felt this connection to Lucas Hawkins, she would explore what might grow between them. The school board meeting was set for 10 o'clock. Elizabeth arrived early, dressed in her most professional attire, references and teaching certificates in hand. The town hall was an imposing two-story building of red brick, fronted by a small park where children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Inside, Elizabeth was directed to a meeting room where 4 men sat around a table strewn with papers. She took a deep breath and entered, chin held high. Gentlemen, good morning. My name is Elizabeth Thornton. I understand you're in need of a teacher for your school. The oldest of the men, a portly individual with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up with surprise. Indeed we are, Miss Thornton, though I don't recall corresponding with you about the position. I recently arrived from Boston, Elizabeth explained. I have my credentials here, as well as references from the academy where I previously taught. She hesitated, then added, Mr. Lucas Hawkins suggested I speak with Mr. Harold Miller. At Lucas's name, the atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The portly man Miller, presumably regarded her with increased interest. Lucas Hawkins, you say? Don't often hear his name from newcomers. He gestured to an empty chair. Please sit. Tell us how you came to know our reclusive rancher. Elizabeth gave them a simplified version of her broken wheel and Lucas's assistance. By the time she finished, all 4 men were nodding approvingly. If Lucas Hawkins vouches for your character, that carries weight in these parts, Miller said. He's a man of excellent judgment, if somewhat solitary habits. The interview proceeded smoothly from there. Elizabeth's qualifications were reviewed and found more than adequate, her teaching philosophy discussed and approved. By the meeting's end, she had been offered the position with a salary that, while modest, would allow her to live comfortably in Black Hawk. School term starts in 3 weeks, Miller informed her as they concluded. That should give you time to settle in and prepare your curriculum. The schoolhouse is at the north end of town, needs some attention, I'm afraid, but we'll have it ready for you. Thank you, gentlemen, Elizabeth said, rising to shake each man's hand in turn. I won't disappoint you. As she left the town hall, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had done it, secured her position, taken the first step toward building her new life. The next 3 weeks stretched before her, full of possibilities. Elizabeth spent the remainder of the day exploring Black Hawk, familiarizing herself with its layout and meeting some of her future neighbors. The town was growing rapidly, fueled by silver mining operations in the surrounding mountains. There were several general stores, a dressmaker's shop, 3 saloons, a church, and even a small lending library, the latter discovery particularly delighting her. She found a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who offered her a clean, comfortable room at a reasonable rate. By evening, Elizabeth had arranged to move in the following day and had even purchased fabric for new curtains to brighten the somewhat sparse accommodations. It was only as she prepared for bed in her hotel room that Elizabeth realized she hadn't thought of James Whittaker once all day. The wound that had driven her across the country seemed less raw somehow, as if the Colorado air and the unexpected kindness of a certain rancher had begun the healing process without her even noticing. The following week passed in a blur of activity. Elizabeth settled into her room at Mrs. Henderson's, met many of the town's residents, and spent considerable time at the schoolhouse, cleaning and organizing in preparation for her students. The building was indeed in need of attention, but the school board had arranged for repairs as promised, and by the end of the week, it was beginning to look like a proper place of learning. Through it all, her thoughts often drifted to Lucas. She had promised to visit, yet propriety suggested she give it some time. Rushing back to the ranch too quickly might appear forward, even desperate. Still, each night as she lay in bed, she found herself missing their conversations, the quiet comfort of his presence. 10 days after her arrival in Black Hawk, Elizabeth was arranging books on the shelves of the schoolhouse when she heard the door open behind her. Assuming it was one of the workmen who had been repairing the roof, she didn't immediately turn around. "I believe those natural science volumes should be grouped together," a familiar voice observed. Elizabeth whirled to find Lucas standing in the doorway, hat in hand, a slight smile playing about his lips. Her heart gave a ridiculous leap at the sight of him. "Lucas," she exclaimed, then collected herself. "I mean, Mr. Hawkins. What brings you to town?" "Supplies," he said, stepping into the room. "And I wanted to see how you were settling in." His eyes took in the half-organized schoolhouse. "I see you've been busy." "Very," Elizabeth agreed, suddenly aware of her dusty apron and disheveled hair. "The school board has been most supportive. Classes begin in less than 2 weeks now." Lucas nodded, looking around the room with appreciation. "They chose well in hiring you. This place already feels different." "Thank you." Elizabeth smoothed her apron nervously. "And the ranch? How are things there?" "Quiet," Lucas admitted. "Mrs. Porter says the house feels empty without you cataloging books and asking questions about everything under the sun." Elizabeth laughed. "I do tend to be curious." "It's one of your finer qualities," Lucas said warmly. He hesitated, then continued. "I was wondering if you might join me for dinner this evening? There's a decent restaurant at the hotel." The invitation, so simply offered, made Elizabeth's pulse quicken. "I'd like that very much." 7 o'clock? Lucas suggested. "I have some business to attend to first." 7 would be perfect, Elizabeth agreed. "I should go back to my boarding house and make myself presentable." Lucas's eyes traveled over her, taking in the smudge of dust on her cheek and the loose tendrils of hair escaping her bun. "You look perfectly fine to me, but I'll wait if you insist." The compliment, delivered with such sincerity, warmed Elizabeth from within. "A lady does have her standards, Mr. Hawkins." His smile broadened. "Indeed she does, Miss Thornton. I'll see you at 7. After he left, Elizabeth found it difficult to concentrate on her task. She finished arranging the books haphazardly, knowing she would need to reorganize them later, and hurried back to her boarding house to prepare for dinner. Mrs. Henderson raised her eyebrows when Elizabeth mentioned her plans, but made no comment beyond offering the use of her copper bathtub. By 6:45, Elizabeth was dressed in her best evening gown, a deep green silk that she had brought from Boston, one of the few fine things she hadn't sold to finance her journey west. She had arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style and even applied a touch of rouge to her cheeks. Lucas was waiting in the hotel lobby when she arrived, looking handsome in a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, efforts at refinement that touched Elizabeth deeply. "You look beautiful," he said simply as she approached. Thank you, Elizabeth replied. You clean up rather well yourself. The restaurant was indeed decent, if not as fine as those Elizabeth had frequented in Boston. They were shown to a corner table, relatively private, and provided with menus. I recommend the trout, Lucas said. Fresh from the mountain streams. Then trout it shall be, Elizabeth decided, closing her menu. After the waiter had taken their order and brought a bottle of wine, Lucas leaned forward slightly. Tell me about your first days in Black Hawk. Is it everything you hoped? Elizabeth considered the question. It's friendly, more so than I expected. The people have been welcoming, especially once they learned I was to be the new teacher. Teachers are valued out here, Lucas said. Education is harder to come by than gold. I've met some of my future students already. They seem eager to learn, Elizabeth continued, warming to the subject. One boy, Daniel, he's 12, has been helping me organize the school library. He's read every book they have twice over. Lucas listened attentively as she described her preparations for the school term, offering suggestions about local history she might incorporate and promising to lend books from his father's collection. Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, moving from education to ranching to books they had both enjoyed. I've been reading that Dickinson volume you gave me, Elizabeth said as they lingered over coffee. Her perspective on life and death is so immediate. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me, Lucas quoted softly. That one has stayed with me. Yes, Elizabeth nodded. She understands that death is not just an ending, but a transition, a journey. Lucas studied her face in the candlelight. You've thought a lot about journeys lately. I suppose I have, Elizabeth acknowledged. Leaving Boston, coming west, it's been a journey in more ways than one. And now that you've arrived at your destination? Lucas asked, his tone careful. Is it what you sought? Elizabeth held his gaze. I'm beginning to think that perhaps I haven't reached my final destination yet. The words hung between them, full of implication. Lucas's hand moved across the table to cover hers. Elizabeth, he began, I know it's only been a short time, and you're just establishing yourself here. I don't want to rush you or complicate your new beginning, but I find myself thinking of you constantly. His honesty emboldened her. I think of you too, Lucas. More than is probably wise. A smile tugged at his lips. Wisdom seems overrated at the moment. Indeed it does, Elizabeth agreed, turning her hand beneath his so their palms met. But I do need time to be certain that what I'm feeling isn't just gratitude or a rebound from what happened in Boston. Lucas nodded, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist. I understand, and I'm willing to wait, to give you all the time you need. His eyes, earnest in the dim light, held hers. Just know that when you're ready, I'll be here. They parted that night with a chaste kiss at the door of her boarding house. But the promise in that simple touch stayed with Elizabeth long after Lucas had tipped his hat and disappeared into the darkness. The following days established a pattern. Lucas came to town every few days, ostensibly on business, but always finding time to visit Elizabeth at the schoolhouse or take her to dinner. Sometimes they would simply walk together through town, talking of their days and their dreams. On Sundays, he would accompany her to church, sitting beside her in the pew with quiet dignity that drew speculative glances from the congregation. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She was falling in love with Lucas Hawkins, perhaps had been since those quiet evenings on his porch, but caution born of past hurt made her hesitate to acknowledge it fully, even to herself. School began with 28 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. Elizabeth threw herself into teaching with enthusiasm, creating lessons that engaged her diverse class and establishing herself as firm but fair. The children responded well to her methods, and soon parents were stopping her on the street to express their appreciation for her work. Lucas took pride in her success, listening attentively as she recounted classroom triumphs and challenges during their time together. One evening in late September, nearly a month after she had started teaching, he arrived at the schoolhouse as she was grading arithmetic papers. I have a proposition for you, he announced without preamble. Elizabeth looked up, amused by his directness. That sounds intriguing. What sort of proposition? The kind that involves a picnic, 2 horses, and a Saturday away from town, Lucas replied, leaning against her desk. The aspens are turning in the high country. It's a sight worth seeing. The idea appealed immensely. Elizabeth had been working long hours, and a day in the mountains sounded like perfect respite. That sounds wonderful, but... She hesitated. But, Lucas prompted, would it be proper? The two of us alone for an entire day? Even as she voiced the concern, Elizabeth recognized it as a remnant of Boston propriety that seemed increasingly irrelevant in her new life. Lucas considered this. We could invite Mrs. Henderson as chaperone, he suggested, eyes twinkling, though I suspect she might find the ride rather taxing. Elizabeth laughed, imagining her plump, elderly landlady on horseback. Perhaps not. And I suppose my reputation as the schoolteacher is already established enough to withstand a bit of gossip. Is that a yes, then? Lucas asked, hope evident in his voice. It is indeed, Mr. Hawkins. A picnic in the mountains sounds delightful. Saturday dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for riding. Lucas arrived at the boarding house promptly at 8, leading 2 horses, his own chestnut stallion and a gentle bay mare for Elizabeth. Good morning, he called as she emerged, dressed in her riding clothes. Ready for an adventure? Elizabeth's heart lifted at the sight of him, relaxed and smiling in the morning light. More than ready. They rode north out of town, following a trail that wound steadily upward into the mountains. As they climbed, the vegetation changed, pine and spruce giving way to groves of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered gold in the sunlight. It's breathtaking, Elizabeth marveled, reining in her horse to admire the vista that had opened before them. The entire valley spread below, a patchwork of greens and golds, with Black Hawk nestled like a toy town in the distance. Worth the climb? Lucas asked, drawing his horse alongside hers. Absolutely, she assured him. I've never seen anything like it. They continued higher, eventually reaching a small meadow ringed by aspens. A stream tumbled over rocks nearby, its musical gurgling providing a peaceful backdrop to the scene. This is perfect, Elizabeth declared as Lucas helped her dismount. He spread a blanket in a sunny spot and unpacked the picnic basket. Mrs. Porter had prepared cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apples, with a bottle of wine carefully wrapped in a cloth. They ate leisurely, talking and laughing, more relaxed in each other's company than Elizabeth had been with anyone in a long time. After the meal, they walked to the stream, where Lucas showed her how to skip stones across the surface of a small pool. My father taught me when I was a boy, he explained, demonstrating the technique. Said it was an essential skill for any young man. Elizabeth tried, failing miserably on her first few attempts before finally getting a stone to skip twice. Huh, did you see that? Lucas's smile was tender. A natural talent, clearly wasted on teaching when you could be professional stone skipper. The pay is probably comparable, Elizabeth joked, selecting another flat stone from the streambed. They continued their game until Elizabeth's arm grew tired, then returned to the blanket. Lucas stretched out on his back, arms folded behind his head, gazing up at the canopy of golden leaves above them. Elizabeth sat beside him, drawing her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. Thank you for bringing me here, she said softly. It's been a perfect day. Lucas turned his head to look at her, his expression serious. Elizabeth, there's something I need to say. She tensed slightly, suddenly nervous. Yes. He sat up, shifting to face her directly. I've been patient, giving you time as I promised. But I find my feelings growing stronger with each passing day, and I need to know if there's any hope that you might someday return them. The directness of the question took her breath away. Yet isn't this what she had been waiting for? A man who spoke honestly of his feelings rather than playing games or making empty promises. Lucas, she began, her voice hardly more than a whisper. My feelings for you have grown as well. But I'm afraid. Of what? He asked gently. Of being wrong again. Of trusting and being betrayed. She looked down at her hands. Of not being enough. Lucas reached out, tilting her chin up so she met his gaze. You are more than enough, Elizabeth Thornton. You are brave and intelligent and kind. And since the moment you walked into my life with that broken wagon wheel, I've been falling in love with you. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. I think I've been falling in love with you too, she admitted. And it terrifies me how much I want it to be real. It is real, Lucas assured her, taking her hands in his. What I feel for you is more real than anything I've known since Sarah. I never thought I'd find this again, never wanted to. But here you are, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." Elizabeth's heart felt too full for words. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her confused, wonderful feelings into the gesture. Lucas responded with equal fervor, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "Does this mean you'll give us a chance? See where this might lead." "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. "Yes, I want that very much." The ride back to town was filled with a new awareness of each other, a sense of possibility that made even the familiar trail seem fresh and exciting. They spoke of practical matters, how often Lucas could come to town, when Elizabeth might visit the ranch, what they would tell curious neighbors. "People will talk," Elizabeth noted as they approached the outskirts of Black Hawk. Lucas shrugged. "Let them. We're not doing anything wrong." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "But I am the schoolteacher. There are certain expectations about my behavior." "Then we'll be discreet," Lucas said. "But I won't hide how I feel about you, Elizabeth. Life's too short for that kind of pretense." His words warmed her, reinforcing the rightness of her decision. This was not Boston, with its rigid social codes and whispered judgments. Here in Colorado, people valued honesty and hard work above all. If she and Lucas conducted themselves with dignity, their relationship would be accepted. The autumn passed in a golden haze of happiness. Lucas came to town twice a week, sometimes helping with repairs at the schoolhouse, other times simply escorting Elizabeth on walks or to church socials. On weekends, when weather permitted, she would ride out to the ranch, where Mrs. Porter welcomed her like a daughter, and they would spend peaceful hours reading in the library or riding the trails of Lucas's property. Their courtship progressed with a natural ease that convinced Elizabeth more each day that what they shared was genuine and lasting. Lucas never pushed for more than she was ready to give, respecting her boundaries while making his own feelings abundantly clear. By Thanksgiving, their relationship was common knowledge in Black Hawk, generally met with approval. Elizabeth had proven herself as a dedicated teacher, and Lucas, though somewhat reclusive, was respected for his integrity and fair dealings. If some of the town's single women were disappointed that the handsome rancher was spoken for, they kept their feelings to themselves. Mrs. Henderson, who had appointed herself Elizabeth's unofficial guardian, surprised her by endorsing the match wholeheartedly. "That Lucas Hawkins is a good man," she declared one evening as they sat by the fire in her parlor. "Went through terrible times and came out decent instead of bitter. That says something about a person's character." "Yes, it does," Elizabeth agreed, thinking of how Lucas had shared his pain with her, not to elicit sympathy, but to explain how it had shaped him. "And the way he looks at you," Mrs. Henderson continued, nodding sagely. "Like you're the sun and moon combined. My Harold looked at me that way, God rest him. It's a rare thing, that kind of regard." Elizabeth blushed, but didn't contradict her landlady. She had seen that look in Lucas's eyes, a mix of admiration, desire, and something deeper that made her feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. As December approached, bringing with it preparations for Christmas, Lucas arrived at the schoolhouse one afternoon with an unusual request. "I'd like you to come to Denver with me next weekend," he said as he helped her erase the chalkboard after classes had ended for the day. "There are some supplies I need that can't be found in Black Hawk." Elizabeth paused in her task. "Denver? That's quite a journey for supplies." Lucas looked slightly sheepish. "Well, there might be other reasons for the trip as well. A new restaurant I've heard about. Perhaps a visit to the Opera House. And I've arranged rooms at the Windsor Hotel, separate rooms," he added hastily, seeing her expression. "Mrs. Porter will accompany us as chaperone." The thought of a weekend in Denver, her first real excursion since arriving in Colorado, was enticing. "That sounds wonderful, Lucas. But what about school?" "I've already spoken with the school board," he admitted. "They've agreed to dismiss classes on Friday, given how hard you've worked these past months." Elizabeth shook her head, amazed at his thoughtfulness. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I try," he said simply. "Is that a yes?" "It's a definite yes," Elizabeth confirmed. The journey to Denver took most of a day by stagecoach, but the discomfort was forgotten when they arrived at the Windsor Hotel, the finest establishment Elizabeth had seen since leaving Boston. Their rooms were adjacent on the second floor, with Mrs. Porter's serving as a proper barrier between them. After refreshing themselves from the journey, they dined at the hotel restaurant, where the food and service would have satisfied even the most discerning Boston palate. The following day was spent shopping. Lucas insisted on buying Elizabeth a new bonnet despite her protests and exploring the growing city. That evening, Lucas escorted Elizabeth to the opera house, where a traveling company was performing La Traviata. Dressed in her finest gown, with Lucas handsome in evening attire beside her, Elizabeth felt a surge of happiness that had nothing to do with their elegant surroundings and everything to do with the man at her side. During the intermission, as they strolled through the lobby, Lucas guided her to a quiet corner. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked, his eyes warm with affection. "Immensely," Elizabeth assured him. "Thank you for arranging all this." Lucas took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something. "Elizabeth, there's a reason I wanted to bring you to Denver, beyond simply showing you a good time." Her pulse quickened at the seriousness in his tone. "Oh." To her astonishment, Lucas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I had a whole speech prepared," he said with a nervous laugh, "but now I find I can't remember a word of it." Elizabeth stared at the box, her heart racing. "Lucas." He opened it to reveal a ring, a single pearl surrounded by small diamonds, elegant in its simplicity. "Elizabeth Thornton," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "These past months have been the happiest I've known in years. You've brought light and laughter back into my life when I thought those things were lost to me forever." Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes, but made no attempt to stop them. "I love you," Lucas continued, "with all that I am, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. All her past doubts and fears seemed to evaporate in the face of this man's honest love. What they had built together in these months was real and true, a foundation strong enough to build a lifetime upon. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Lucas, I will marry you." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that disregarded propriety entirely. Elizabeth returned his kiss with equal fervor, uncaring of the curious glances from nearby patrons. "I love you," she whispered against his lips when they finally parted. "And I love you," he returned, his smile brighter than all the gas lamps in Denver. Mrs. Porter, when informed of their engagement upon their return to their hotel rooms, expressed delight, but no surprise. "About time," she declared, wiping a suspicious moisture from her eyes. "Been waiting for this news since September, I have." They were married on a crisp, clear day in late February 1877, in the small church in Black Hawk. Elizabeth wore a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Henderson and several other ladies from town had helped her make, carrying a bouquet of winter greens and dried flowers. Lucas, handsome in a new suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such pure happiness that it brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. The entire town, it seemed, had turned out for the occasion. Elizabeth's students sat in the front rows, the girls sighing romantically and the boys fidgeting in their Sunday best. The school board members and their wives occupied places of honor, as did the handful of neighboring ranchers with whom Lucas did business. After the ceremony, a reception was held at the town hall, where tables groaned with food contributed by nearly every household in Black Hawk. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and well wishes, the community coming together to celebrate one of their own finding happiness. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth and Lucas slipped away to begin the journey to the ranch, their home now. Mrs. Porter had gone ahead that morning to prepare the house, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first night together. The stars were brilliant overhead as Lucas helped Elizabeth down from the wagon and carried her across the threshold of the ranch house. A fire burned welcoming in the hearth, and fresh flowers, a luxury in February, adorned the tables. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hawkins," Lucas said softly, setting her on her feet in the parlor. Elizabeth looked around the room that had become so dear to her over the past months, then back at the man who now was her husband. "It feels like I've come full circle," she observed. "From a broken wagon wheel to here." Lucas drew her into his arms. "Sometimes the most unexpected detours lead us exactly where we're meant to be." "Indeed they do," Elizabeth agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. And I am precisely where I'm meant to be. Epilogue 5 years later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Lucas taught their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. Their daughter, Sarah, barely a year old, gurgled happily in her arms, reaching out with chubby hands toward her father and brother. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. Lucas's skill with horses had attracted buyers from as far away as California, and Elizabeth had established a small school on the property for the children of neighboring ranchers, unable to completely abandon her love of teaching even after resigning her position in Black Hawk following James's birth. Mrs. Porter still managed the household, though she had gradually ceded more responsibilities to Elizabeth as the years passed. The older woman doted on the children as if they were her own grandchildren, spoiling them with cookies and stories. As Elizabeth watched her family, contentment washed over her. The pain that had driven her west was now just a distant memory, a chapter in her life that had led her to greater happiness than she could have imagined. The broken heart she had carried across the country had been mended by a man who understood loss and renewal, who loved her for exactly who she was. Lucas looked up, catching her eye across the yard, and smiled that same smile that never failed to warm her from within. He said something to James, then crossed to join her on the porch, reaching for Sarah, who went to him willingly. "Happy?" he asked, settling the baby on his hip. Elizabeth leaned into his side, watching as their son continued his careful circles on the pony. "Completely," she confirmed. "Are you?" Lucas pressed a kiss to her temple. "More than I ever thought possible. You and our children are everything to me, Elizabeth." She turned her face up to his, still marveling at the journey that had brought them together, a broken wagon wheel, a chance encounter on a lonely road, and two hearts finding in each other exactly what they needed to become whole again. "I love you, Lucas Hawkins," she said softly. "And I love you, Elizabeth Hawkins," he returned, "with all that I am and all that I ever will be." From the corral, James called for them to watch as he guided his pony in a perfect circle, his small face alight with pride. Together, they turned to applaud their son's achievement, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future might hold, they would face it as they had faced the past together, stronger for having found each other when they least expected it.